The chandelier in the Meta Grand Ballroom cost more than my father's house. I know this because Vandana, my mother-in-law, told me so. Not to impress me. To remind me. She had a way of doing that, of embedding a blade inside a sentence so perfectly that by the time you felt the sting, she was already across the room, laughing with someone who mattered. That evening was the Kapoor Group's annual investor dinner. The kind of event where men in tailored suits discuss disruption while their wives discuss each other. I had dressed carefully, a deep wine silk sari, my hair pinned back, no jewelry except the single gold bangle my mother pressed into my hand the morning I left our village for Mumbai. I thought I looked composed. Elegant, even. I was wrong about what the evening would require of me. Vandana found me near the window, standing alone while my husband Vikram circled the room shaking hands. She arrived with two women I didn't recognize, both from old Delhi money, both wearing the particular expression of women who have never once doubted their own welcome in a room. There she is, Vandana said, and her voice carried just enough warmth to make the introduction feel generous. My daughter-in-law. Vikram's wife. Not Asha. Not our Asha. Vikram's wife. A possession. A footnote. She's from, where was it, darling? Vandana tilted her head at me, but she didn't wait for my answer. A small village. Outside Nagpur. You know how Vikram is, always collecting interesting things. The two women smiled with their mouths. I smiled back with mine. Inside, something very quiet and very old went still in me. Not broken. Not wounded. Still. The way a lake goes still before a storm rolls in from the east and rearranges everything. Here's what Vandana did not know about me that night. She did not know that 3 weeks earlier, I had seen 2 pink lines on a test I took alone in our apartment bathroom at 6 a.m. while Vikram slept. She did not know that I had sat on the cold tile floor for a long time, holding the test, doing the particular kind of mathematics that women like me are trained early to do, calculating risk, calculating exposure, calculating silence. She did not know that AR Holdings, the entity she had never once asked Vikram to explain, held 53% of the equity in Kapoor Vikram Technologies, the company her husband Dinesh had co-founded with our money. Our money. Mine and Vikram's, yes. But structured, at my insistence, through instruments that only one person in the room that night had fully read. Me. I am Asha Rao. I have a postgraduate degree in financial law from a university that Vandana once called provincial, without knowing I had graduated first in my class. I grew up in a house with one ceiling fan and a mother who taught mathematics to children who couldn't afford the school up the road. My father repaired motorcycles. On weekends, he read me the newspaper. I am exactly the village girl they thought I was. And I am exactly nothing they imagined. It started before the dinner. It started, I think, the week after our wedding. Vandana had a gift for making disdain look like concern. She would say things like, I just worry that you must find Mumbai so overwhelming after where you grew up, in a tone so soft it was nearly maternal. She would offer to teach me which caterer to call, which club membership mattered, which jeweler was acceptable, not because she wanted to help, but because each offer was a small act of colonization. A reminder that I was a foreigner in a country I had every legal right to occupy. Dinesh, my father-in-law, operated differently. He was the kind of man who ignored you so completely that his attention, when it finally arrived, felt like a reward. He acknowledged me in 2 contexts only, when he needed Vikram to do something and Vikram wasn't answering his phone, and when the company needed documentation that required a co-signatory. He never once asked what I did. What I knew. What I thought. This was a mistake that would eventually cost him everything. The microaggressions were daily and precise. A place setting at family dinners positioned slightly outside the main cluster. A conversation about travel that included everyone but redirected away from me when I mentioned I had been to Singapore for a conference. A habit Vandana had of speaking to Vikram about household decisions in my presence, as though I were a houseplant that had wandered into a business meeting. Vikram noticed none of it. Or chose not to. This, I have come to understand, was its own kind of message. She arrived in our lives disguised as an opportunity. Ria Desai was 31, IIT educated, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from never having been made to feel small. She had been brought in as head of product strategy for KVT, Kapoor Vikram Technologies, a hire Dinesh pushed through over a long weekend without a formal board process. I noted this. I filed it. Vikram came home from her first week of work and described her the way men describe women they are not yet sure what to do with, precisely. The exact color of her ideas. The particular sharpness of her mind. The way she had completely reframed how the team was thinking about the Series C roadmap. I asked one question. Was there a board vote to approve the hire at that compensation tier? Vikram looked at me the way he had been looking at me more often lately. Like I was asking about the wrong thing. It's an operational decision, Asha. Dad and I agreed. Your father is not on the operating board, I said. He's on the advisory board. Vikram set down his glass. Why does this always become a legal discussion with you? I didn't answer. I went to the kitchen. I stood at the window and looked out at the city, all those lights, all those people moving through their ordinary evenings. And I thought about the baby I hadn't told anyone about yet, and I thought about the equity structure I had spent 4 months designing, and I thought about a word my mother used to say in Marathi that doesn't translate perfectly into English but means something close to, the patient field always outlasts the impatient farmer. Within 6 weeks, Ria was attending the same industry dinners we attended. She was in photographs with Vikram at launch events. Once, a mutual acquaintance texted me a photo from a rooftop party I had declined, citing exhaustion, which was true, because the first trimester was swallowing me whole, in which Vikram and Ria were standing very close together and laughing at something I would never know. I did not confront him. I did not cry. I made a note. Not out of coldness. Out of precision. The first time I understood what Vandana was building, I was 7 weeks pregnant and sitting in her living room while she served tea I hadn't asked for. You seem tired, she said. More than usual. I'm fine. Vikram mentioned you've been a little reactive lately. Emotionally. She said it gently. She always said things gently. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Some women find the pressures of this lifestyle difficult to manage. This lifestyle. As though I had stumbled into a resort I couldn't afford. I'm not finding anything difficult to manage, I said. Of course. She smiled. I just think, and I say this with love, that Vikram is under enormous pressure right now with the Series C. The last thing he needs is to come home to tension. Men in his position need a certain kind of steadiness around them. I heard the sentence underneath that sentence with perfect clarity, you are not steady. You are the problem. He needs something you are not. 2 weeks later, I had dinner with my college friend Preeti, who worked in corporate communications. She mentioned offhandedly that she had received a call, someone asking whether I had seemed stable during a difficult professional period 3 years ago. Preeti had been confused. She'd said nothing concerning, she assured me. But she was asking me if I knew who might be making such calls. I did not know with certainty. But I could triangulate. Vandana was building a file. Quiet conversations. Casual inquiries. The slow, patient assembly of a narrative that could be deployed, in a family court, in a board conflict, in a custody dispute that hadn't yet been named, that Asha Rao was emotionally fragile, professionally erratic, and perhaps not the most suitable steward of anything that mattered. I want you to understand something. The cruelty of this kind of warfare is not in any single action. It is in its invisibility. There is no moment you can point to. No document. No raised voice. Just a slow accumulation of impressions, passed from mouth to ear, until the story precedes you into every room. I sat with this knowledge for 3 days. Then I called my lawyer. Not to react. To prepare. The confrontation, the one that broke something between us that I am not sure had ever been fully intact, happened on a Tuesday. Vikram had come home late. Again. He smelled of a restaurant I recognized, an upscale place in BKC where the lighting was low and the booths were private. He wasn't drunk. He was simply absent, present in the apartment, absent from me. I told him I knew about the calls Vandana was making. I told him I found it troubling that people in my professional network were being quietly surveyed about my mental state. I told him, calmly, that if his mother was compiling a profile of me, I deserved to know why and to what end. He listened. He had the look of a man who had been briefed, who had received this information before I delivered it and had already decided on his posture. Asha, he said. Mum is worried about you. That's all. You've been. I've been what? Difficult. To be around. Lately. He paused. She mentioned you've been emotional. Irrational, sometimes. There it was. Irrational. The word that men have used for centuries to dismiss women who see clearly and speak plainly. The word that means. Your perception is not welcome here because it complicates the story we are already telling. I felt the temperature of my own body drop. I want you to think very carefully, I said, about whether you believe that. I'm not attacking you. I'm asking you to consider. Vikram. I said his name once, quietly. Do you know the full capital structure of your own company? He blinked. The non sequitur disoriented him, which was the point. What does that have to do with? I'm asking. Of course I know my own company's structure. Then you know who holds majority equity. I hold equity. Dad holds equity. The institutional investors. Look it up, I said. When you have time. Look up AR Holdings. I went to bed. He did not follow for a long time. I lay in the dark with my hand on my stomach, still flat, still secret, and I listened to the city breathing outside the window, and I understood that something had arrived at its final shape. Not a crisis. A clarification. I was no longer waiting to be understood by the people who had already decided what I was. I was simply waiting for the right moment. The Series C round was the largest fundraising event in KVT's history, a potential 480 crore rupee injection from a Singapore-based institutional fund. It required full governance documentation. Shareholder disclosures. Board ratification. Dinesh had been moving pieces for months. I watched it the way you watch a chess player from across a room. You can see the intention before the hand reaches the board. He was attempting to dilute AR Holdings. Not illegally. Carefully. Through a preemptive rights waiver he had drafted into the term sheet, a provision that, if accepted without contest, would have reduced our holding stake from 53% to below 30%, crossing below the threshold that triggers mandatory consent rights under the shareholders' agreement. It was elegant. I will give him that. He had assumed, I think, that AR Holdings was a passive entity. A vehicle Vikram had set up for tax efficiency, managed by accountants, reviewed by no one with real comprehension. He had seen the name on documents for years and never once asked who sat behind it. I had never volunteered the information. My lawyer, a woman named Sunita who had been my mentor since my internship years and who possessed the particular calm of someone who has won quietly many times, reviewed the term sheet the evening it arrived. She called me at 10 p.m. They've structured this to bypass you, she said. I know. If you sign, you're below threshold. I know. If you don't sign, the round collapses. They'll be furious. I know that too. A pause. Then, from Sunita, the only response appropriate to the situation, when do you want to move? The meeting was scheduled for a Friday morning. A full board session to ratify the Series C term sheet before the Singapore investors arrived for final due diligence the following week. The room, a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of the KVT offices in Andheri East. 8 people seated. Vikram at the head. Dinesh to his left. 3 institutional board members. A company secretary. A legal representative from the Singapore fund who had joined by video. I was not on the original attendee list. I arrived anyway. When I walked in, Vikram's face moved through several expressions in rapid sequence: surprise, confusion, something approaching panic, before settling on a tight professional neutrality. Dinesh watched me cross the room to an empty chair with the expression of a man who has just heard an unexpected sound in a house he thought was empty. Asha, Vikram said. This is a board meeting. I'm aware. I set my folder on the table. AR Holdings holds 53% of ordinary shares in this company. I think that qualifies me to be here. Silence. Not the ordinary pause of a meeting interrupted. A different quality of silence, the kind that precedes a reordering of the world. Dinesh recovered first. He was a man accustomed to recovering. AR Holdings is a vehicle entity. Its representative needs to be formally registered as. I am the registered representative, I said. I've been the sole director of AR Holdings since its incorporation. Sunita, would you share the documentation with the room? Sunita, seated 2 chairs down, calm as a banyan tree, opened her laptop and turned it so the company secretary could see the screen. The corporate registry. The directorship records. The shareholder agreement cross-reference to the current term sheet. The Singapore representative on the video screen leaned forward. Could you clarify, he said, slowly, the preemptive rights structure as it pertains to the majority shareholder? Yes, I said. The term sheet as currently drafted contains a preemptive rights waiver in Clause 8(c) that, if executed, would dilute the majority holder below the consent threshold established in Schedule 2 of the shareholders' agreement. That Schedule 2 provision was negotiated at the Series A stage. It cannot be unilaterally waived without the majority holder's written consent. I paused. That consent was not sought. This term sheet, in its current form, cannot be ratified. Dinesh placed both hands flat on the table. This is not the appropriate forum to. With respect, the Singapore representative interrupted, and the phrase landed in the room like a stone into still water. This is exactly the appropriate forum. If there is a governance question about the term sheet, we need it resolved before we proceed. We cannot finalize due diligence with a contested shareholder structure. Vikram had not spoken. He was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, not anger, not love, but something rawer. Recognition. As though he were seeing the actual dimensions of something he had been living next to for years without measuring. How long, he said. Quietly. Have I held the majority? Since month 8 of our marriage. I kept my voice level. Before the Series B restructuring. Before your father moved the institutional seats. Since before any of the decisions that affected this company's governance were made without adequate shareholder consultation. You never told me. You never asked about my work. A pause. You never asked about AR Holdings. Not once. In 6 years. The room was very quiet. I turned back to the Singapore representative. I am not here to collapse this round. I am here to ensure it is structured with full transparency and proper governance. AR Holdings is prepared to consent to a revised term sheet, one that preserves the consent rights established in the shareholders' agreement, and that is ratified through a properly constituted board process. I looked at Dinesh. One that includes only those board members whose appointment was formally approved. Not advisory board members operating outside their mandate. This was the second blade. Dinesh's presence at board meetings had been a long-standing informality, the kind of thing that happens in family companies when the founder's patriarch simply assumes his place at the table. No one had ever challenged it because no one had needed to. But informality, when you hold the majority equity, is a governance violation. A documented one. The company secretary had gone very still. I'll need to verify the board composition, she said softly, in the direction of no one in particular. I've prepared a memo, Sunita said. It's included in the documentation package. I stepped out of the boardroom at 11:47. The meeting was suspended pending legal review. The Singapore representatives had politely and firmly requested a 48-hour pause. Dinesh had left the room without looking at me. Vikram had stayed seated, staring at the table. The corridor outside was long and glass-walled, overlooking the city below. I stood at the window for a moment. Just a moment. I want to tell you something about revenge that no one tells you. It doesn't feel triumphant. Not in the way you imagine when you're small and cold and someone has looked through you as though you were made of air. The actual moment. The moment the structure collapses, when the people who thought they had built something impenetrable discover the ground shifting beneath them, it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like grief. Not for them. For the version of events where none of this was necessary. Where a man had looked at his wife and said, "Who are you, really? What do you know? What do you carry?" Where a woman had not needed to build her protection into the architecture of a company because she felt safe enough to simply exist inside the walls of her own marriage. I stood in that corridor and I held my stomach and I thought about the child who did not yet know any of this. Who was growing, quietly, in the particular dark of unknowing that belongs only to the not yet born. And I made a decision. Not about the company. About my son or daughter. I would tell this child the truth. Not as a story of victory. As a lesson in reading rooms. In reading documents. In reading silences. In understanding that love is not protection, and that protection must be built by your own hands, and that the most powerful thing a person can carry into any room is the knowledge that they have already done the work. 2 days after the board meeting, Vandana called Vikram. I know what was said because Vikram told me. Not voluntarily, but because I asked, and because something had shifted between us in that glass-walled room. Some pretense had been removed, and he was not yet sure what to put in its place. She had told him that my behavior in the boardroom was proof of what she had been observing for months. Erratic. Aggressive. She had used the word unstable 3 times in a single conversation. She had mentioned, carefully, almost tenderly, that given my pregnancy, which she had apparently deduced though I had not told her, the emotional volatility was understandable, but that the child's well-being needed to be protected. The child's well-being needed to be protected. From me. This is the part that I want you to sit with, because it is the part that reveals the true shape of the strategy. The corporate manipulation was one thread. The social condescension was another. But this. The quiet suggestion that I was an unstable pregnant woman who might not be fit to be trusted with her own child, this was the third thread. And without it, the fabric of the whole plan would have been incomplete. Vandana needed me destabilized at home, discredited professionally, and preemptively framed as an unreliable mother. These were not separate projects. They were one. What did you say to her? I asked Vikram. A long pause. I told her she was out of line. I looked at him. Was that the first time you've said that? He didn't answer. Which was its own answer. I need you to understand, I said, that the documentation of my supposed instability, the calls to my former colleagues, the language your mother has been using in social settings, constitutes an actionable pattern. I have had it catalogued by my lawyer for the last 6 weeks. Vikram looked up. I am not telling you this as a threat, I said. I am telling you because you are the father of this child, and I need you to decide, clearly, finally, whose side of reality you are standing on. I'm not on anyone's side. That is not an acceptable answer anymore. I left the room. I went to stand on our building's terrace in the evening air, looking out at the city I had arrived in 8 years ago with a single suitcase and a mind full of things no one had yet asked me to use. The city looked the same as it always had. Enormous. Indifferent. Full of people building things. I breathed. The board review took 11 days. During those 11 days, 3 things happened in sequence, each one a small precise detonation in the structure that Dinesh and Vandana had built over a decade. First, the governance audit confirmed that Dinesh had been attending and voting in board meetings as a non-constituted member for 4 years. 2 board resolutions, including one that had approved Ria's hire at a compensation tier requiring board ratification, were invalidated. The Singapore Fund's legal team flagged this in a formal letter. The word misrepresentation appeared in the 3rd paragraph. Second, the institutional investors who held the minority stake, a Mumbai-based fund whose senior partner I had met twice at industry events and who had never once been told that AR Holdings was majority held by anyone other than a passive corporate vehicle, requested a formal stakeholder meeting. At that meeting, I attended as the director of AR Holdings and as myself. I presented the revised term sheet Sunita had drafted, one with full consent protections, a reconstituted board, and a governance addendum that would prevent the kind of informal decision-making that had defined the company for years. The fund agreed. Third, the story of the governance irregularities became, inevitably and despite everyone's best efforts, known in the circles that mattered. Not a news story. Not a scandal in the public sense. But in the rooms where Mumbai's technology money moved, the dinners, the clubs, the quiet industry networks. It became known that the Kapoor family had been operating their flagship tech company with a majority shareholder they had apparently never acknowledged, and that the majority shareholder was the village girl at the end of the banquet table. Vandana's social architecture depended on the story of me as peripheral. Inconsequential. A woman who had entered the family on a kind of tolerance visa, permitted to remain as long as she stayed decorative and uncomplicated. The moment that story was replaced not by an argument but by a fact, a verifiable, documented, publicly knowable fact, the narrative she had been building for 6 years became structurally impossible to sustain. You cannot gaslight someone who holds the majority. I want to tell you about what did not happen. There was no screaming match. No dramatic confrontation in Vandana's drawing room. No moment where I listed her sins and watched her crumble. That is not how power asserts itself when it is done correctly. Power does not announce itself. It simply moves, and others move around it. I did not call Vandana to gloat. I did not send a message. I did not ask for an apology, which she would not have given and which I did not need. What I did do, I had my lawyer send a formal letter to the family documenting the pattern of reputation-damaging inquiries that had been made to my professional contacts over the previous 3 months. The letter was factual. It named dates. It named the individuals who had been contacted. It requested that these activities cease and desist. The letter was also evidence. Should anything, any custody dispute, any attempt to frame me as an unfit mother, any legal proceeding in which my credibility or mental stability was called into question, ever materialize, the letter would exist. The documentation would exist. The timeline would exist. Every small act of quiet warfare had been recorded, cross-referenced, and filed by someone who understood that the battlefield was not made of loud moments but of paper. This is what women from places like where I grew up learn early, if they are paying attention. The powerful use loudness and ceremony to obscure the fact that the real work was done quietly, long before the performance began. My father taught me to read. My mother taught me to calculate. The village they thought disqualified me had given me everything I needed. I want to be careful here, because the truth about Vikram is not simple, and I do not believe in easy villains. Vikram was not a bad man. He was a man who had been raised to believe that certain arrangements were natural, that the women around him would adjust, absorb, accommodate, and that the absence of complaint was the same as the presence of contentment. He had never been required to see his wife as a counterpart. No one had ever asked him to. I do not think he was in love with Ria. I think she was easier than me, easier in the specific way that someone who makes no claims on you is easier. Someone who does not ask you to look at the structure of your own company and your own marriage and reckon with what you find. We had one honest conversation. Not an argument. A conversation. He asked me why I had never told him about AR Holdings. Because you never asked, I said again. But also because I didn't trust that it would be protected if I disclosed it. Not with your father involved in daily operations. You thought I would take it from you. I thought the structure around you might try. I paused. I wasn't willing to find out by losing it. He was quiet for a long time. What do you want now? I want to raise this child, I said. With honesty. I want a marriage that is built on actual knowledge of each other, not the version we perform for your family's social calendar. I want your father formally removed from operational decisions. I want your mother's campaign against my credibility to stop. I looked at him. And I want you to decide, not for me, not because I am the majority shareholder, but because you are going to be a father, and your child will eventually understand the choices you made in this period. He did not answer immediately. But he did not look away. What happens between Vikram and me beyond this story is ours, and private, and not yet fully written. I will tell you only this. There is a difference between a marriage that ends and a marriage that begins again from a more honest place. I do not know yet which one we are in. But for the first time in 6 years, neither does he. And that uncertainty, that shared, unresolved, genuinely open question, is the most equal thing we have ever held between us. Part 13, The Closing. My daughter was born on a Tuesday, 7 months after the boardroom. The labor was long. Vikram was there. He held my hand in the particular helpless way of people who are witnessing something they cannot control, and I loved him for that helplessness more than I had loved him for most of his competence. Vandana came to the hospital. We did not embrace. We were civil, because civility is what we had, and it was enough for the room we were in. She looked at the baby, this small, determined creature who had arrived with a full head of dark hair and a manner of looking at faces that felt, absurdly, like assessment, and something in Vandana's expression shifted. Not softness, exactly. Something more complicated. The look of a woman who has built a world and is beginning to suspect that the next generation will not live in it the way she designed. I named my daughter Mrinalini, after my mother. The reconstituted board of KVT held its first formal meeting 6 weeks after the governance review was complete. Dinesh was not present in any capacity. A new independent chair had been appointed. The Singapore round closed at a revised structure. Cleaner, more transparent, more valuable for having been properly documented. AR Holdings remained the majority shareholder. I attended the meeting as its director, in a kurta and no jewelry except my mother's gold bangle, with my daughter in a carrier against my chest. One of the institutional investors, a man in his 60s who had been watching me throughout the governance proceedings with an expression of careful recalibration, stopped me in the corridor afterward. "You've been patient," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was an observation, the way you might observe a calculated move on a board. My father used to say, I told him, that a well-made thing doesn't need to announce itself. He nodded. He moved on. I stood in that corridor, the same corridor where, months earlier, I had stood in the aftermath of exposure and felt grief, and I looked out at the city. Below, 1 million people were doing the work of becoming who they were going to be. Arriving. Building. Calculating. Holding things close until it was time to reveal them. Mrinalini slept against my chest, unknowing. She would know one day. She would know all of it, not as a story of what was done to me, but as a demonstration of what was built. She would grow up understanding that power is not shouted. That a name on a document can mean more than a seat at a table. That the women who are dismissed first often remain standing last. And she would understand. I would make sure of it, that the village her grandmother repaired motorcycles in, the single ceiling fan, the mother who taught mathematics to children who couldn't afford the school up the road, none of it was a starting disadvantage. It was always, the whole beginning. The chandelier in the Meta Grand Ballroom cost more than my father's house. The company its owners thought they controlled is mine. I have never once raised my voice about either of these facts. I didn't have to.